I seek refuge in Allah from Shaitan, the accused. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Praise be to Allah. We seek Allah's help and forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah from the evil of our own souls and from our bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah guides will never be led astray, and whomsoever Allah allows to go astray, no one can guide. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is Allah's slave and messenger. O you who believe, fear Allah as Allah should be feared, and die not except in a state of Islam. All praises are to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. Today I am here to talk to you about the reality of domestic violence within the Muslim community and what each of us can do to put an end to it once and for all, inshallah. In the matter of domestic violence, FBI statistics revealed that every 9 seconds a woman is physically assaulted in the United States, resulting in 3.4 million American women being abused each year. Therefore, in the time it has taken me to make this statement, at least one woman has been attacked physically by her intimate partner. Perhaps you may ask, why is this relevant to me? As you look around the room, to the left of you, to the right of you, based on these statistics alone, someone here is a victim or a survivor of domestic violence, or grew up in a home where there was violence. She does not wear a sign on her which says, I am a victim of domestic violence. You only know her as this sister who prays beside you. It is important for us to acknowledge that domestic violence does not affect only women. Statistics reveal that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. And 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking. Several years ago, I was asked to speak at a mosque which had a high incidence of domestic violence. However, they had one requirement. I could not speak negatively against the men in the community. I renamed this particular talk An Affair of the Heart, and use it as an opportunity to speak on the fact that yes, men are also victims of domestic violence. Historically, every man who abuses a woman is in fact himself a victim of some form of abuse. No one is born an abuser. It is not our natural fitra, the pure state of being that we all come into the world with. There is something or someone in an abuser's past who either encouraged, instilled, or taught them to abuse. Regardless of one's gender, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or social economic status, abuse does not discriminate. Domestic violence is always wrong, no matter the gender of the victim or the gender of the perpetrator. And the perpetrator, just like the victim, could be anyone around you. Domestic violence is most commonly recognized as physical or sexual violence against an intimate partner or family member, but it also includes the use of intimidation, coercion, and threats, isolation by cutting the victim off from their family and their friends, minimizing, denying, blaming, gaslighting the victim, using their children as a way to force the victim to stay, and most commonly, financial abuse to control and limit the freedom of the abuse. These are all forms of domestic violence that a lot of us don't even realize, and we are living with it, not realizing it. One of the most crippling types of domestic violence is the emotional and psychological manipulation, abusers use to brainwash their victim to believe you have no self-worth, physical beauty, or intelligence to exist without an abuser. Nobody else would want you. Abusers also use love bombing by strategically overwhelming their victims with extravagant, grand displays of affection, especially immediately following an abusive episode. And while they may be apologetic with words which may have been said many times before, victims, especially us as women, we have a forgiving heart. It's what makes us such good mothers. They want to hope and believe the promises they're hearing and find it hard to hold on to past experiences. These tactics are just some of the many reasons why it is so hard for victims to leave physically abusive partnerships, although it may seem like a simple solution to others. Dear believers, domestic violence is criminal, not religious. Don't let anybody tell you differently. What this means is that domestic violence is found in every community, even the Muslim community. Domestic violence exists as a human imperfection in a perfect religion. Allah says not once but twice in the Holy Quran, an oppression is more deplorable than murder. And once again, Allah warns us, an oppression is more serious than murder. Although domestic violence victimizes all groups and genders, today I am focusing on Muslim women because of the way that stereotypes about Islam and Muslims aid in silencing this particular demographic. Stereotypes are often used as a tool to dehumanize and justify violence against marginalized groups. For example, because of the way popular media portrays Muslim men, some Muslims fear that by admitting domestic violence exists in our community, that this will lead those in the West to believe that Islam is a violent religion that oppresses women, and that these stereotypes will be used to justify even more discrimination, violence, and war against Muslims as a whole. Domestic violence is criminal, not religious. To make matters worse, I have seen that when Muslim women seek refuge in existing shelters, they are told that because they are part of that religion that says it's okay to beat women, the only way for them to be able to enter these shelters is by leaving Islam and converting to Christianity. In other words, they have to sell their soul for a safe place to be. After 30 years of providing services to victims of domestic violence, I realized that there are several reasons to be spiritually sensitive to every culture and religion, be they Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or otherwise. Something I learned is that when one is being abused, the only means that gets them through that is their handhold to God. If for no other reason than their well-being, we must not break that hold. Therefore, in 2007, as executive director and founder of Muslimat Nisaa, I opened my home to shelter homeless Muslim women, victims of domestic violence, not as a discriminatory effort, but to counteract the same prejudices still in existence and being highlighted in social media today. That's only to fulfill an unmet need to assist victims as they struggle to achieve and regain their self-esteem, their self-worth, their self-sufficiency. Fearing stereotypes is a moral blinder that we have created for ourselves. The reality is that domestic violence is a universal problem amongst all faiths and groups. Therefore, we cannot let victims in our own communities suffer in silence Denial is simply counterproductive, and it assists the abusers in their oppression. Muslim women who face domestic violence at the hands of Muslim men find themselves caught in a difficult situation. Do they come forward about the abuse in their own nuclear family at the risk of reinforcing stereotypes and perpetuating violence against their greater Muslim family around the world? Or do they sacrifice their personal safety for the so-called greater good of protecting their worldwide Muslim community? Many make that decision. Allah answers these questions very clearly in the Quran. Surah Nisaa, O you who believe, be ever steadfast in upholding equity, bearing witness to the truth for the sake of Allah, even though it be against your own selves, or your parents, or your kinfolk. Whether the person concerned be rich or poor, Allah's claim takes precedence over the claims of anyone, anything else. Do not then follow your own desires, lest you swerve from justice. For if you distort the truth, behold, Allah is indeed aware of all that you do. It is stated in the Quran, O you who believe, keep your duty to Allah and fear Allah and speak always the truth. In order to solve any problem, we first have to openly admit we have a problem. However, through my work, I have found that many Muslim women are afraid to attend not just a lecture on the subject, but also fundraising events that would help sustain, support, and increase the numbers of those being rescued from domestic violence. The stigma is too strong. The fear of retaliatory repercussions is too triggering, or perhaps they have accepted the way abusers strategically displace their own shame and guilt onto their victims, and they too blame victims for the abuse they're suffering. You made me hit you. Because unchecked domestic violence escalates, the consequences of this silence in our community can be deadly. In 1999, Sister Lubna was murdered in Ohio by her husband. In 2008, Sister Candela was murdered in Atlanta because she wanted a divorce. And in February of 2009, when the husband of Asia Zubair found out she had filed for divorce, he stabbed her 40 times and murdered her in front of their children. When the gruesome details of Asia's story was taken up by the media, it became evident we couldn't hide it anymore. That yes, our community is not immune to this social disease. Domestic violence does exist in the Muslim community, and it exists because of the silence, our silence, that protects and enables it. It is important to note that Asia's husband was a wealthy and powerful man, yet he hid his abusive tendencies, which is why we need to make sure that we as a community do not allow the threat of anti-Muslim hatred to stop us from exposing the truth of domestic violence. Our community's focus on our outward image as Muslims cannot be prioritized over the truth of what it means to be a Muslim, to be a charitable human being with excellent character and morals. Allah warns us in the 107th chapter of the Quran, Surah Ma'un, woe then unto these praying ones whose hearts are distant from their prayer, those who want only to be seen and praised and deny all kindness to their fellow human. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, clearly stated, The believers who show the most perfect faith are those who have the best behavior, and the best of you all are those who are the best to their wives. How dare we insult the example of our beloved prophet, knowing that he never hit his wives or children. Our beloved prophet made a point in his final sermon to remind all believers to treat women with kindness, and empowered Muslim women with the right to divorce their husbands if they are not satisfied with them. How can we possibly say that we love Allah's messenger, yet continue to ignore his message? The messenger of Allah said, when you see an evil act, you have to stop it with your hand. And if you can't, then at least speak out against it with your tongue. If you can't, then at least you have to hate it with all your heart. But this is the weakest of faith. We must remove our blinders, which keeps us from being able to see, and rise to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has called us to do. This means creating a community that doesn't protect or reward those who abuse others by keeping their acts unexposed. People who abuse do so with the intent of using power and control to force the individual to execute the world as they see it. What they don't realize is that it is the illusion of power and control that they are after, but they will never achieve it through force, because truly powerful people don't have to use force or manipulation to achieve their goals. It is important for us to create a society that recognizes that abusing others is, in fact, an act of the weak and the insecure. We need to create a society that empowers the survivors. Even those who survive domestic violence suffer long-lasting symptoms and CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You hear about that a lot. That can take a lifetime to recover from, and if left untreated, can be passed down from one generation to the next. Survivors of abuse are more likely to suffer from depression and suicidal thoughts, addictions, and chronic illnesses. And even after leaving one abusive behavior, they can often end up in yet another toxic relationship, environment, or even workplace, because their ability to trust themselves and assert their boundaries has been so severely damaged through the abuse. Something that I learned in this work, when we speak about a woman who does this, goes from one toxic relationship to the other, and I shared with her, basically what you're doing, you keep marrying the same man over and over again. And she asked me, what did that mean? And it meant what I just said, that these are the types of relationships that you choose to be in because of the damage that has been done to yourself and to your self-esteem, that you don't even realize it. It should not be possible that we as Muslims do not feel the pain of this violence. An-Nu'man ibn Bashir reported, the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, the parable of the believers in their affection, mercy, and compassion for each other is that of a body. When any limb aches, the whole body reacts with sleeplessness and fever. We must not subscribe to a moral indifference. We must feel their pain. I am honored to have been welcomed into this mosque in the company of all of you who are not afraid to acknowledge the existence of domestic violence. Unfortunately, in many Muslim circles, I have been deemed a fitna, controversial. someone who is bringing harm to the greater community. They're the abusers, and I'm bringing harm by warning the community against those who abuse. However, as someone who is a member of the Muslim community, I love Allah. I love Allah's messenger. As director and founder of a shelter established exclusively for Muslim women victims of domestic violence, a nurse, and a chaplain, and one being involved in this work for the past 45 years, my goal has always been to serve to eradicate domestic violence in the Muslim community. And inshallah, together, by raising our voices in our community's awareness, we will. Ameen. I say what I have said. May Allah forgive all of us. Alhamdulillah, all praise and thanks are due to Allah alone. It was 2 o'clock one morning inside the shelter when a Muslim woman victim of domestic violence housed in my shelter awakened me in a frightened state of emergency. I thought to myself, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Surely this must be a medical emergency. When I rushed downstairs, what I found was a mother pleading with me to go to the store and purchase a Kit Kat for her 3-year-old son. It's a piece of candy, for those who don't know, it's a Kit Kat. As I looked at this little boy, barely standing at the height of her knees, kicking at her, beating on her, tears welled up in my eyes. In that moment, I feared that I would never see domestic violence eradicated in my lifetime because the abusers of tomorrow are already born. And the need for eradication and supportive services have yet to be realized. When this woman came to my shelter with her young son and daughter, I witnessed an un-Islamic cultural norm whereby she had been indoctrinated to accept abuse. This mother and her daughter had been inundated by brainwashed acceptance through the use of a phenomenon best described as learned helplessness. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, learned helplessness is a situation where a person doesn't try to break away from a negative situation or attempt a particular task because he or she believes that it is impossible to do so. Such behavior occurs when a person has failed on the previous attempts or have witnessed others fail. Having never witnessed this before, I was happy for this woman when I was contacted by her parents, her mother and father. Although it was against shelter policy, believing it to be in her best interest, I agreed to permit them to come and visit with their daughter. That would help her heart. To my surprise and dismay, I discovered that the purpose of their visit was not to comfort and console their daughter, but rather to convince her to drop the charges against her husband and return back to him. Her reality? That she was married to her cousin, the son of her father's brother, and in this, her father's loyalty was not to his daughter, but to his brother. Sadly, her mother said nothing. Yet another example of learned helplessness. I have experienced housing those in my shelter whose cultural upbringing taught them that it's better to be dead than divorced, even though this belief directly contradicts the Quran and the life of our beloved Prophet. And although they were brought to me by the police or social services or hospital personnel, these women return to their abusive husband rather than bring what would be deemed as disgrace, dishonor to their family. Because of these cultural practices that betray Islamic teachings, I have had those who I trusted to transport women to my shelter actually enable the abusers. Because when the women victims finally had a window of opportunity and made the decision to leave the abuse, and they escaped, and I would call them because, it might be any time of the day or night. If they were somebody that was nearby, and I would call them and ask them, could you go and pick up our sister? She needs to be brought to the shelter. Instead of bringing them safely to me, I found out there were people I entrusted to transport women to my shelter, convinced these victims to stay patient and return back to their abusive husband. But they didn't have to take the beatings for her. They didn't feel her pain. We cannot permanently solve the problem of domestic violence by only rescuing women who have already been abused. In order to make lasting changes, we as a community need to create an environment in which the diseases of domestic violence does not have a chance to grow and spread. We need to take preventive measures. A few things we can each do to stop this problem and inshallah prevent it from happening in the first place. Speaking out against domestic violence in our community is the very first step. We need to remove the stigma by ending the silence, and we need to speak up and speak out until every member of the community has heard the message loud and clear. Domestic violence will not be tolerated here. So they need to know. Domestic violence will not be tolerated here. And victims will be believed if they speak up. Many victims are not believed. There was a situation in which when I was trying to be able to get financial support for the shelter, and I went to the imams and I told them about the issue of domestic violence. And instead of believing the victim, their statement was, what did she do to make him beat her? MashaAllah. Another step is to share this khutbah. When this video comes out, hold a gathering in your home to watch it with your friends and family and discuss the topic afterwards. Use your circles of influence to reach those who most need to hear the message, whether they are currently a victim or an abuser. Don't assume you don't know any. Support and advocate on behalf of victims. Why do so many victims suffer in silence? Because we as a society don't make it safe for them to come to us for help. They're always accused. It's your fault. You did something wrong. Women need to support other women. We need to want for our sisters what we want for ourselves. Muslimat al-Nisaa's advocacy policy is to ensure the safety of our residents, physical, psychologically, emotional, economic, and spiritual. This starts with the woman herself, advocating for her well-being, because the Muslim community is behind in understanding the issues of domestic violence. We must work with Muslim women on repairing their self-esteem, their self-worth. We advocate for her. We then advocate for her within her surrounding Muslim community to help those in her circle understand her struggle so she can return to a healthy life in the community. Finally, we advocate for her within the greater American society to make sure she has the tools and opportunities to be a contributing citizen. Remember that domestic violence can happen to anyone, male or female, young or old, rich or poor, from any cultural or religious background. Don't be fooled by a person's position in society or the role they play. The majority of high-profile cases are derived from people in positions of power or wealth. In fact, families of police and military suffer the highest rates of domestic violence, over 4 times more than the general American population. We need to pay attention to the red flags. Often abusers will isolate victims from their friends and family. Check in on your family, your friends who have slowly stopped attending their usual get-together. Remember, isolation. Isolation. I've had sisters where the men locked them up in a room, and the only way they got out was they escaped through the bathroom window. We need to pay attention to the red flags. Don't be fooled by a person's charismatic, loving personality. Abusers can be narcissistic and manipulative, and they have the ability to switch their rage on and off, depending on who is around or who they think is listening. I again refer to Asia's husband, whom I actually met in my role as the chairperson of the Council of Muslim Organizations. He was trying to be able to get the television program in Virginia, and I met with him. Just as sweet and kind and respectful as you would think a man or a kind man would be. You know, bought me a gift, might have been donuts, but yes, he was very kind. I would never envision him to be somebody that could stab a woman 40 times. He did not present that as an image. And in that moment, I was fooled. Even if their victim leaves them, an abuser can always find another person to prey on. As a society, we need to make sure we are not only taking care of victims, but that we are also preventing abusers from victimizing. Yes, people do have the ability to change, but they will never change if their community enables and excuses their behavior by keeping it silent. That is the worst thing we do. It's bad enough if we don't feel their pain, and it's even worse if we keep it silent. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Help your brother or sister whether they are an oppressor or an oppressed." People ask, "Oh, Allah's apostle, is it all right to help them if they are oppressed? But how should we help them if they are an oppressor?" The Prophet said, by preventing them from oppressing others. Remember that exposure to domestic violence not only affects those who are abused, but also has a substantial effect on children, family members and relatives, friends, co-workers, and other witnesses in the community at large. As a result of the infusion of media coverage, on some level, we have now all become victims of domestic violence. In 2009, Rihanna, a successful female singer, was punched in the face and strangled by her boyfriend. Not only did she experience this physical boundary violation by her abuser, but they leaked photos of the abuse all over the media. Remember that institutions, businesses, organizations, and even mosques can either help stop or perpetuate domestic violence because of their policies. Domestic violence is a problem which needs to be approached from the inside out, and not the outside in, something which cannot be accomplished without the application of resources and culpability. The NFL, the entertainment industries, as with any organization, institution, or association, need to have standard policies and procedures in place which recognize that domestic violence is inherent in our society. Despite their position or frame, no abuser should be excused, and the consequences of their actions must be applicable to all guilty parties. After all, how much is a life worth? These standardized protocols of accountability need to be in place, not only for the culprit who commits the act of abuse, but also for the ones who help cover it up, in order to protect the powerful and protect their own positions. According to the United States Department of Justice, between 600,000 and 6 million American women are victims of domestic violence each year. What are the women who are abused every 9 seconds, who receive no press coverage, no media attention, no justice, no voice? These are the women I serve. These are the women for which your support is needed. Remember that gossip on the community level and continued exploitative media coverage on the national level is damaging to all involved and is akin to rubbing salt into their wound. The gruesome details of Asia's murder was shared with the world. The images and constant media coverage did not take into consideration that there are other family members, especially children, who will now and forever be impacted by this news. Truly, this is an unnecessary abuse of power against the innocent. How is this psychological abuse any less damaging than the physical abuse which the abusers are guilty of? And while domestic violence is a crime which can and should be played out in the public court system, media sensationalism involving the continual exposure of individuals' personal lives is not a required element in order to obtain justice or a judgment. There is no justice for Asia's children, now permanently, forever stigmatized for the rest of their lives. Knowing that somebody can Google their mother's name or their father's name and all of those details about how their mother died. Can you imagine that? Permanently stigmatize a child, an innocent child, innocent children. If you do find out someone you know has been abused, we need to have patience with the victims and understand that as much as we want them to exit their situation quickly, only they know the true dangers they are facing. Oftentimes it takes several failed attempts for victims to break past the fear instilled in them and work up the self-worth in order to leave. We shouldn't assume they have the same privileges we do: money, transportation, a place to go. Because sisters, I humbly share with you that there are times when we may not agree with a woman's decision, but must respect her right to make what we may consider to be a wrong decision. I was called about a Muslim sister who was known in the community for quite some time that she was a constant victim of abuse, sometimes even being put out of her house in the winter without a coat or headscarf or proper clothing in general for the weather. On a particular cold and snowy night, I received an anonymous call from a Muslim woman asking me to please go and rescue a Muslim sister who was a victim of domestic violence and been put out of the house by her husband. I drove to where I was told she was and attempted to bring her to the shelter. I pleaded with her. This sister shared with me she had 2 teenage daughters, and she feared that if she left, that her husband would beat or even sexually abuse them. As one mother to another, although I proposed accepting all 3 of them because of his position and financial status, she and I both knew that I could not guarantee anything, especially since his abuse was not only well known but ignored and enabled by the greater community. I understood and did not superimpose what I wanted her to do over my decision to protect her daughters. And as a mother, I can't say that I would not have done or would not have made the same decision. We need to teach the children in our lives to have strong boundaries and to have a zero tolerance on those who disrespect their boundaries. We need to empower children with the ability to say no, and we should not force them to go along with uncomfortable behaviors simply out of the sake of politeness or cultural tradition. We need to make sure our community does not perpetrate spiritual abuse or victim blaming. Nobody has the right to force another to forgive their abusers for the sake of Allah. Forgiveness is part of their personal healing process. Do not use religion to force victims to stay patient for the sake of Allah. Allah gave Muslim women a right to divorce. And we know this because our beloved Prophet Muhammad married divorced women as a way to remove the stigma and taboo surrounding divorce. Patience is something we practice when we have tried everything and nothing works. Spiritual abuse also happens when people share false hadiths about women needed to submit to their husbands in order to fulfill a cultural interpretation of how they think marriage is supposed to work. Allah tells us what marriage should look like in the Quran, which states, and among Allah's wonders is this: Allah creates for you soulmates out of your own kind, so that you might incline toward them, and Allah engenders love and tenderness between you. In this, behold, there are messages for people who think. Don't allow people to manipulate verses of the Quran like the highly misunderstood verse, which many have erroneously interpreted to mean it's okay to beat your wife. Allah clearly tells us in the Quran, "O you all who believe, it is not permissible for you to inherit women against their will, and neither shall you place difficulties on them so that they can take away some of what you have already given them." We need to create a cultural environment that supports mental health, one in which people can openly talk about their fears and vulnerabilities without being shamed or mocked. Abusers are often adults who themselves were victimized and abused as children, and they never learned how to regulate their emotions or express their feelings in a safe way. We need to make it okay for men and boys to express feelings other than anger. Dear sisters, our beloved Prophet Muhammad used to cry openly in public, and he was the best man that ever lived. Once a man accused the Prophet of being weak and less than masculine because of his tears, and our beloved Prophet responded that tears are a sign of mercy from Allah, and that one who does not cry has no mercy in their hearts. We especially need to stop forcing little boys to act manly, so described as having the ability to physically overpower others. We need to recognize that men and women share the exact same emotions, and that under all, anger is often the emotion of grief and sadness. As women, we have a special power to create an environment that fosters safety for boys and men when we show them it's okay for them to be fully themselves, tears and all. And we should celebrate them for their strength in being courageous enough to be vulnerable and sensitive. One of the most important things you can do to end domestic violence in the Muslim community is to support Muslimat and Nisaa financially and to encourage other Muslims to do so as well. Some important statistics from the RAVE, Religion and Violence e-learning study show that when victims have access to shelter services, it leads to a 60 to 70% reduction in incidence and severity of reassault. Shelter services lead to greater reduction in severe reassault than seeking court or law enforcement protection or moving to a new location. I know a lot of our sisters, they obtain protective orders. And what I share with my sisters, yes, that is a piece of paper. It doesn't stop bullets. It doesn't stop a knife. Doesn't stop a fist in your face. What it does is, when he beats you again, you can take him to court. if you live. When you give, take into consideration all those who could be helped by your support of an organization that represents those who have no notoriety and lack the financial means of the salaries garnered by those with the means to cover their crime. There are women who manage to rise up out of the life which handicapped the generations before them. This is the reason I established Muslimat al-Nisa shelter. However, I did not want to just shelter them, whom their circumstances forced them upon this path, but rather give to them an incentive and the opportunity to become self-sufficient through achieving a higher education. Too often, girls who could change their world for the better are locked out of that future by the circumstances of her birth or the customs of her community or her country. My goal is to facilitate the rescue and housing of those whom escape from a country, communities where girls are devalued, brought, sold, and abused. Wanting for Muslimat al-Nisa shelter to continually be there for her, providing not just a refuge from abuse, but also the basic human needs to survive. Violence against women is a human rights violation. It is a shameful abomination for any communities that fail to prevent it, and any societies that not only tolerate, but also in fact promote it. It is most shameful for the Muslim community because of how directly it goes against the fundamental teachings of Islam. It must be eliminated through all sectors of society. An effective response to violence must be holistic, addressing the immediate practical needs of women experiencing abuse, providing long-term care and assistance, and focusing on changing those cultural norms, attitudes, and legal provisions that promote acceptance. Unfortunately, when we don't get the funding we need, our hands are tied and victims suffer. This past August, a woman, a Muslim sister named Jamila, was killed by the father of her children, who had just been released from jail. She had a protective order, who had just been released from jail. And the weeks prior to her murder, Jamila contacted us many times for help. And I desperately reached out to the Muslims nationwide to help place her and others in a shelter. But we were unable to fundraise enough money to help her. She had so many children. I couldn't afford to keep her. Her death could have been prevented. Please give as generously as you can to the refugees and Muslims suffering outside of the U.S. Please give as generously as you give to refugees and Muslims who are suffering outside of the U.S. Remember, charity begins at home. Help your sisters here first. Finally, we all need to speak the truth, even against ourselves. It doesn't matter if the perpetrator is your family member, your respected elder, or your community leader, your brother, your sister, your imam. It doesn't matter if the abuser is your child. If your child is abusing their spouse, it is your Islamic duty to speak out against it and do your part to stop it. Let us make dua for all victims of domestic violence, especially those who are already impacted, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove from us the moral blinders and the consequences of this disease. Ameen. Allah commands justice, doing good, and generosity toward relatives, and Allah forgives what is shameful, blameworthy, and oppressive. Allah teaches you so that you may take heed. Recite what has been revealed to you of the book and stay consistent in prayer. Indeed, prayer restrains the human from lewd and wicked behavior, but the remembrance of Allah is even greater, and Allah knows everything you are doing. Let us perform our salat.